Dotty Dimple at Play, Chapter 6, A Strange Visit. The same warfare of words continued to come up from the kitchen, and presently the odor of sausages stole up too. Mrs. Rosenberg was preparing supper. It seemed to the impatient Dotty that she was a long while about it, but she worked as fast as she could, with so many children clinging to her skirts and impeding her movements. "Supper, Mandeline," called she at last in a shrill voice, and the little girls went down. The supper was palatable enough, but very unwholesome, and the tablecloth was dirty and wrinkled. "You don't seem to like my cooking," said Mrs. Rosenberg, with a displeased glance at Dotty's full plate. "Yes'm," replied the little guest faintly, "but I've eaten up my appetite." At the same time she swallowed a little oily gravy in desperation, and looked slyly to see if Solly was watching her. Yes, he was, and so were all the rest of the family, as if she had been a peculiar kind of animal just caught and caged. "I suppose they are dreadful nice folks at your house," continued Mrs. Rosenberg. "I almost wonder your mother let you come here to play with my poor little girl. Mandy's just as good as you are, though. You can tell her so, and she's got a sight prettier eyes." Dotty's heart kept swelling and swelling, till presently it seemed as if there wasn't room enough in her whole body to hold it. She thought of the cheerful, orderly tea table at home. She recalled her mother's gentle ways, her lovely face, and longed to kiss her cheek and whisper, "Forgive me." "Mamma'll be just as patient with me," thought Dotty. "She always is. But if I once get home, I'll never make her patient any more. I'll never run away again, not unless she asks me to. I won't." The children, as fast as they finished their suppers, jumped up and ran away from the table, all but Solly, who had some fair idea that it was not polite to do so before company. He was a natural gentleman, and it was unfortunate that just at this time his mother was obliged to send him to Montjoy of an errand. Otherwise he would have made his sister give up Dotty's hat, and perhaps would have walked home with the unhappy child himself. As it was, Dotty did not seem to have a friend in the world. It was now so dark that she hardly dared look out the doors, but even in the brightest daylight she could not have found her way home. "You've got to stay all night," said Mandeline. "Isn't that splendid?" Mandeline did not mean to be cruel. She had observed that her mother urged her own guests to stay, and sometimes kept them almost by force. This, she supposed, was true politeness. More than that, she was anxious for the private reasons to hold Dotty so she might not have to knit so much. She knew, too, that her mother was proud to have such a well-bred little girl in the house, so she would not give up Dotty's hat. At 8 o'clock, Dotty went to bed with Mandeline in the unfinished chamber, sorely against her will, and Mandeline told her such dreadful stories that she could not close her eyes for fright. "This is the queerest house I was ever in," thought she, "and the queerest bed. I suppose it's made of pin feathers, for they stick into me awfully." The bed was on the floor, and was founded upon wool sacks and buffalo skins. The sleeping arrangements in the house were somewhat peculiar. Mrs. Rosenberg was like the old woman in the shoe, and she stowed her numerous family away for the night in as little space as possible. For instance, the 4 youngest children slept together in one trundle bed, 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom, their feet coming together in the middle. But Mandeline had left the trundle bed and was lying on the floor with her guest. The companion the trundle bed, little Cassina, was quite indignant at being deserted, and made a loud outcry in the hopes of attracting her mother's attention. At another time Dotty would have laughed heartily. It was so absurd for a child to be lonesome when there were 3 in the bed. But Dotty was too low-spirited even to smile. Mrs. Rosenberg came up and boxed Rosina's ears, and after that the trundle bed subsided. At last, when Dotty supposed it must be midnight, though it was only 9 o'clock, there came a loud knocking at the side door. She hid her face under the coverlet, feeling sure it was either a wild Indian or a highway robber. "Don't be afraid," said Madeline, rousing herself. "It is somebody after beer, and Mother has locked up the store." No, it was Mr. Parlin's voice which spoke. Dotty's swollen heart gave a great bound and then sank heavier than ever. "My little daughter, Alice, has run away." That was what he said. "Is she in your house, Mrs. Rosenberg?" "Yes," replied Mrs. Rosenberg. "I expect it's likely she is. But she and my Madeline's been abed and asleep 2 hours." "Oh, papa, I'm wide awake!" cried little Dotty, with an eager shriek which pierced the rafters. "Good night, then," said Mr. Parlin coldly. "Oh, but papa, I want to go home. What did my mamma say about me?" "She said she had sent you of an errand, and when you finished your errand you may come home. Good night." "Oh, not good night!" screamed Dotty, almost falling downstairs in her haste, and fastening her dress as she ran. "It was 'cause Lena hid my hat, and that was why—" "By the way," said Mr. Parlin, without paying the slightest attention to his half-frantic little daughter, who was clinging to his knees and pleading with her whole soul, "Mrs. Rosenberg, I'm sorry to trouble you, but if you will be kind enough to keep this little runaway girl till I send for her, I shall be very much obliged." "Oh, certainly, Mr. Parlin, certainly, sir," replied the Jewess, smiling very sweetly, and trying to pat Dotty's head, which was in such violent motion that she only succeeded in touching the end of her nose. No one who had looked at Mrs. Rosenberg at that moment would have suspected her of being a vixen. She was sure Mr. Parlin would pay her handsomely if she kept his daughter there for a day or two, and the prospect of a little money always made the poor woman very amiable. "Thank you, madam," said Mr. Parlin, gently disengaging himself from Dotty. "When you are tired of my little daughter, will you please let me know? Good night, Mrs. Rosenberg, and good night, Alice." And before Dotty had time to scream again, he was gone. For a moment she stood quite still, gazing at the door latch, then rushed out into the darkness, calling, "Papa! Papa!" But Mrs. Rosenberg laid her strong hands upon her and brought her back. "So your mother didn't say you might come? I thought it was queer. Hush, hush! Don't go into fits, child. There are no bears in this house, and nothing will hurt you." Mrs. Rosenberg's manner was much kinder than it had been before, and with a child's quick insight, Dotty perceived that her father's coming had wrought the change. "I want to go home! I want to go home!" cried she, with another passionate outburst. "Oh, take me, do! They won't send for me, never! Take me, and I'll give you, oh, Mrs. Rosenberg, I'll give you—" For a little while there was quite a scene at the little grocery, and it repented Madeline that she had ever hidden Dotty's hat. The trundle bed waked up at both ends and screamed. The black and tan dog, who slept under the counter in the store, barked lustily. The parrot in the blue cage called out, "Quit that! Quit that!" And Mrs. Rosenberg was afraid a policeman would come in to inquire the cause of the uproar. She pattered about in a pair of her husband's cotton velvet slippers, and tucked all of her little ones into bed again, very much as if they had been clothes in a boiler, which she was forcing down with a stick. She was a woman who would be obeyed, and Dotty, finding it of no use to hold out against fate, went upstairs at last and laid down beside Madeline on the pin feathers. This stolen visit had turned out quite different from her anticipations. Instead of a delightful supper of some mysterious Jewish cooking, she had been drinking gall and wormwood. That Lena would not let her go. That was the gall, and her father made her stay. This was the wormwood. She is a tough piece, sighed Miss Rosenberg, as she laid her weary limbs to repose. I didn't know one while but she'd get away in spite of me. I wonder what her father'll pay me. He seems to think this is a house of correction. Her mother won't be likely to let her stay more than one day. I'll have on the best tablecloth for breakfast, and along in the forenoon I'll fetch out some macaroni cakes and larger beer. That'll coax her up, I guess. Just then Mrs. Rosenberg downstairs and Dotty Dimple upstairs both fell asleep. One dreamed of running away and being chased by a dog with a hat on his head who barked "Good night" as fiercely as a bite. The other dreamed of money and brown sugar, and all the while the rats were treating themselves to nibbles of wood, but nobody heard them. Be careful, old rats, your teeth have done mischief before now. The night wore on to the wee small hours, when a loud noise like a cannon startled Mrs. Rosenberg. Or was she dreaming? The house was shaken to its very foundation, as if by an earthquake, and the room was full of smoke. She was just running for the children when the building fell together with a crash. The roof was blown off into the street, the windows were shivered to atoms, and tongues of flame leaped madly from the ruins. What did it mean? She was so stunned by the shock that she scarcely cared whether one of her children was spared or not. She only thought in her stupor that Mr. Parlin would not pay her for Dotty's lodging if the child was blown to bits. I know how it happened, said she, twitching at her own hair to arouse herself, just as Abraham always said. The rats have been nibbling matches in the store. They've burned a hole through the floor and set fire to that keg of gunpowder. Yes, that's it. It's the end of chapter 6. Dotty Dimple at play.
Hey guys, subscribe to our channel or go see theminimizedlife.com, or you can of course check out some more videos. We've got some great books, but you're gonna want to go to the website if you want some descriptions. We've got all kinds of information there. We'll see you later.